Hello and welcome to today's Smartkarma webinar in collaboration with ASEAN Exchanges. I'm your host, Maliha Hadi. Today, I'm excited to welcome Smartkarma analyst and independent economist, Thomas Lam, who will be discussing the Australia-ASEAN Summit. Thomas has over 2 decades of experience in the realms of economics and finance, with expertise ranging from macro forecasting to advising on investment strategy. Today, he will be discussing the long-standing Australia-ASEAN relationship, the evolution of their international trade dynamics, and what the collaboration means for the future of the region. Tom, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Maliha. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I guess before I jump right in, I just want to say that thanks everyone for attending, and listening to an economics presentation is actually like fine dining. You need to take the time to savor it. So I hope that this presentation gives you a good sense of the partnership and the dynamics behind the partnership and so on. So let me screen share.
Just before we get started, Tom, a bit of standard housekeeping from our end. We are taking live Q&A for this webinar, so we would request your attendees to post their questions at the Q&A tab at the bottom of their screens. And please also refrain from resharing the contents of this webinar without express permission. A recording will be shared with all attendees and will also be available on the registration page. So Tom, let's get started. Over to you.
All right, thanks, Maliha. Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. So this is the outline of the presentation. Pretty standard. First of all, just giving a sense of the qualitative sense and quantitative sense of the ASEAN-Australia cooperation, the relationship, and then jumping into the correlation dynamics, in particular with respect to headline growth, headline GDP growth and exports growth, and then getting into some intricacies behind financial markets. And then I also be looking at the uncertainty given the current backdrop, and what should we take away from that with respect to the relationship between ASEAN and Australia, and then finishing off finally on the future prospects, right? Okay, the qualitative overview, as the first point says, as everyone here knows, that ASEAN was founded in 1967, essentially from original core members of 5 members, expanded subsequently to 10. The 11th member has been admitted in principle, and the official relations between Australia and ASEAN actually commenced in 1974. In Australia, in actuality, was the first dialogue partner. And I think more importantly, when the relations essentially got going back in the 60s and 70s, I think the Whitlam government from the Australian side really took things off and moved it to the next level. Prior to that, things were a bit more lukewarm. But more importantly, I think that the foundation, or at least the cornerstone of the Australia-ASEAN relationship, was actually built on mutually beneficial trade, in particular on the economic side, right, of things. And I think subsequently, the other factors, other aspects, they took more of the other facets of the region into account, and this broadened over the years at least. And in fact, as recent as 2021, as the third bullet point shows, they established a comprehensive strategic partnership, and this partnership essentially talks about, or at least touches on, many broad areas, and there are some priority areas for the next few years, at least in the immediate few years, as the fourth bullet depicts. Encompasses development, technological, economic and financial, environmental, social, cultural, political, and security. I think the clear message here is that it has really blossomed beyond the economic side of things, and given the fact that Australia, and both ASEAN and Australia, they both realize that there is a lot more I guess, partnership and cooperation and anything that goes beyond the basic relationship of just, being trading partners. And then, and finally, back in last year, the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit was held. And after 50 years, and the theme, I think rightfully, it's a partnership for the future, right? But this future, it's not going to be a straightforward future. There'll be bumps, there'll be hiccups, there'll be potholes, but I think that I'll address them shortly. But I think the key thing here is that we need to understand that we have come a long way and we still have a long way to go. So let me move on to the quantitative overview. It gets a bit more colorful. So we start with the ASEAN quantitative, overview. This is just a simple chart giving you a sense of the estimated share of the ASEAN 10 economy, and ASEAN 10 economic bloc, to be more specific, and what is the size of it relative to the other economies, and also, if you take into account the Euro area trade economic bloc, right? If you can see, the US is number one, China. If you count Euro area as one of the blocks, and then India, followed by the ASEAN 10, roughly 5% of GDP. And there are many ways to really try to figure out and try to estimate what the share is. As you know, one way is the purchasing power parity weights, and the other way is the market exchange rates. And we are both pros and cons to it. What I did, however, was to actually combine both the PPP approach and the market exchange rate. So this is just a combination taking into account the pros and cons. And I think that I think beyond that, you have to also take into account even the population dynamics. I mean, if you combine ASEAN 10, Australia, over 700 million people, it's a huge proportion of the global statistics. And this is really the key point here. It is a massive block, and there is a lot of things within the block. It is not strictly homogeneous, very diversified block. And in fact, if you go on to the next slide, this is the trade between Australia and ASEAN. Over the years, and this is in level form, right? US dollar billions of dollars. And the way to look at this is really that the blue line here is just total goods trade, exports plus imports, nominal, between Australia and ASEAN. And what I did here, being a forecaster, is just to keep it as simple as possible. From a technical perspective, looking at the log linear, simple log linear model, looking at upside downside, you get about roughly in the range of maybe about 250, 300 billion or so as you go out to 2040, right? And I think those numbers are more or less in the ballpark of what the Australian studies, or some of these studies have actually discussed. And I think this is a reasonable figure. But like I said, these are just broad trends. There'll be ups and downs as you can see over here. But I think broadly speaking, I think the trajectory will be for it to expand, as you go into the next, decade or more, right? And this is where the nub of the whole aspect of looking at the Australia and ASEAN relationship. So what I'm trying to do here is the next two slides actually is to look at correlation dynamics. And the way to read this is that on the left-hand side, this is just Australian real GDP growth relative to the rest of the world, right? The vertical axis is really the correlation, and this is really to what extent the share of the correlation. So the vertical axis, the share of correlation, and the horizontal axis is just correlation. So as you can see this, the tilt or the skew is toward more positive correlation. This is Australia. And as you can see from the numbers, around 90% of the world is positively correlated with real GDP growth of Australia, right? 10% of that is negative correlation with Australian real GDP growth. Similarly, ASEAN, real GDP growth relative to the rest of the world, 95%. Again, the skew is to the right-hand side. And I think that the broad takeaway here is that both these charts essentially highlight the fact that both Australia and ASEAN, they are both linked to global final demand, right? 95% of the world positively related to ASEAN and Australia real GDP. And if you look at just the growth rates for Australia, roughly 2 to 4%, looking at a whole range of periods. In the more immediate periods, as of the last few years, as you go out the next few years, it's at the low end of the 2 to 4% range. For the ASEAN, it has been in the 4 to 7% range over the years, but it's closer toward the low end of the range in the immediate few years. But like I said, broadly speaking, I don't think there's a lot to say beyond the fact that both of them being dependent on exports, being dependent on global final demand. I think that it's fair to say that there is diversity behind it. As you can see both the charts. I think that I'll give you an example. For instance, I mean, most of the correlation, at least from the ASEAN side, is with Asian economies. I think about roughly 40% of the Asian economies. For Australia, about 30% with the European economies, and then we have the LATAM and African economies, so to speak. But generally, like I said, they are more or less very correlated to the global dynamics. But a bit more, like I said, varied in terms of if you drill down into the different countries, right? And let me go into the next slide on correlation dynamics for exports. This is real exports, and I think that goods only relative to the rest of the world. And again, sorry for the confusion earlier, and really that this is the vertical axis is the share of positive correlation, the share of positive correlation, and the bottom here is really the positive correlation, positive and negative correlation relative to the rest of the world. Just from looking at these two charts, you can see that I think one takeaway is that ASEAN appears to be a bit more positive correlated with exports growth in the rest of the world. Positive correlation of 84% or so. Australia is about 60%. Still fairly high. But I think the takeaway, the key here is really there is more varied trade dynamics, compared to headline growth. And all the charts, as you look at the correlation dynamics, what I essentially did was to look at the pre-COVID and the post-COVID, and then combine them, and then calculate the correlation. And like I said, the skew is more or less to the positive side, for both. And I think that I just want to spend a bit more time on this trade side, because one of the key things to keep in mind is the fact that there's a lot of diversity behind these two countries, ASEAN and Australia, right? Australia, for instance, has a continuing trade surplus with China. ASEAN as a whole, however, has persistent and growing trade deficit with China. And the reason why earmark China because for both these blocks and country, China, as in terms of export share, has the largest share for both, Australia and ASEAN. But having said that, like I said, Australia has a surplus, whereas ASEAN has a deficit. And this merely highlights that, the fact that I think that you cannot just look at both of them and say that, wait a second, they're both very dependent on the global dynamics, but there's also a lot of diversity. If you drill down into the export side, you go beyond the headline GDP numbers. And I think the ultimate broad takeaway after the four charts is really the fact that there are diversification benefits to the partnership between Australia and ASEAN. And the fact that they don't cannibalize on the exports, both, in other words, Australia does not necessarily export, to the same countries as far as the correlation dynamics relative to the ASEAN side. So as a result, I think there is real benefits to the partnership, at least from this angle, right? And I can obviously answer more questions, later on in the Q&A with respect to how some of the export partners of ASEAN and Australia and how that might impact it going forward, especially with respect to the Chinese side, because there is the fact that one has a surplus, one has a deficit. That in itself tells you that there's a lot of things going on behind the numbers, even though both of them are strongly correlated to the global dynamics or global final demand. Okay, so that is the fundamental side. So the next two slides, I will actually get into the financial markets, right? And this looks a bit more complicated. And really, the way to read this is quite straightforward. I looked at the stock market relationship between ASEAN and Australia vis-a-vis the US and China. So on this page, this is ASEAN and US relationship, stock market relationship. This is the change in the equity market indexes. Australia, this is the, like I said, the change in US equity market index, the AXX and the S&P 500. In terms of the ASEAN, if you're interested technicality-wise, I just ran a first principle component of all the ASEAN 5 equity indexes, benchmarks. They are pretty, their core movement is pretty strong. So I grouped it together and come up with the ASEAN as a whole. And what's the relationship with the US S&P? And the different shapes here, basically the green triangles depict the relationship from 2019, the more recent relationship, 2019 until roughly February of 2025. And then the circle is 2015, 2019, and so on and so forth. 2007, 2015 is the asterisk, and then the dots, the red dots are 1999, 2000. So one of the first things to jump out at you is the fact that the relationship between ASEAN and US equity market, right? At least the slope, how sensitive is that? It has actually flattened, right? As you can see here, from 2015 to 2019 is roughly about 0.6. Slope has flattened about 0.3. For Australia, similarly, that's the case. Also, there is the flattening of the slope, but less pronounced, from 0.9 to 0.7. But the general takeaway is that the relationship between both ASEAN and Australia, and US equity markets, I mean, that sensitivity has really diminished, over the years. They're still positive, obviously, but there is a diminishing to some extent. In fact, if I go into the next slide, you can see that even though ASEAN Australia equity market has been a bit less sensitive to the US, they have actually become more sensitive to China. So this is the second sensitivity. This is, again, similar way to interpret this. It's a bit more varied, tends to jump around quite a bit. But I think that's obvious here is that the fact that the more recent sensitivity, again, the green, and this is the purple triangles, is the green triangle, and you can see the slope coefficient, it has actually, increased, right? From 2015 to 2019, there's not much of a relationship between ASEAN and China, but the more recent period from 2019 onwards, close to about 0.8 or so. I mean, barring the fact that I understand that, when there is stress, the correlation jumps to 1 and so on. So that might exaggerate some of the correlation during the COVID time when markets collapsed. But still, I think that even if you take that out of the equation, that sensitivity between ASEAN equity market and the Australian equity market, on the right chart, they have both actually improved or increased over the years. From the Australia side, the increase is a lot starker, right? The coefficient is 3 times, and some of it might be the fact that might be due to the fact that from the ASEAN side, because it's the first principal component, so maybe it tends to lower the slope calculation, but nonetheless, I don't think it takes away from the fact that I think at least from this slide and the slide before, is the fact that there is diminishing sensitivity to US equity markets and increasing sensitivity to the Chinese equity markets, right? And I think that the way to really take this into account is the fact that I think showing the equity markets is just to highlight the fact that I think the partnership of both Australia and the ASEAN side should attempt to leverage the private sector involvement via financial markets, in this case, the equity markets, because the bond markets are a bit less developed, especially for the ASEAN side, to further enhance the cooperation between Australia and ASEAN. And clearly, there are ways to do this to entice or incentivize the private sector. But the fact that there is increasing sensitivity to China, I think that there's the one basic takeaway from this is there is two-sided risk, right? To the financial market or the equity market side. There's upside and downside risk, depending on how Chinese equity markets do. But keeping in mind, even the U.S. equity market relationship with with Australia, I don't think that that is even though he has diminished, it's still pretty strong. And to me, I think that this like I said, as far as financial markets are concerned, there's always a source of risk in terms of how you can really you depend on either China or the US from the financial market side. But at the same time, the fact that you can leverage this off if there's upside, I think that in itself might be a positive. But again, I think that if you look at really from the first two charts on the GDP and exports, a bit more diversified relative to the rest of the world. But as you get into the equity financial market side, there's a bit less diversity there because both Australia and ASEAN are pretty strongly correlated, at least to the Chinese markets, at least in the nearer term, relative to the US. To the US. So let me add on this slide before I go into the future prospects of the partnership. And everyone talks about the general uncertainty behind the current environment. And so what I did here is just to look at the different aspects of uncertainty, right? At least the proxies of uncertainty. And there's no best way to measure uncertainty. So there are many proxies of uncertainty. So what I did here essentially is to look at equity uncertainty, which is a proxy of it is just implied volatility. And then bond market uncertainty, and the proxy here is just, again, implied volatility. And the general uncertainty here is really taking into account economic uncertainty and geopolitical uncertainty. Economic uncertainty, news-based economic uncertainty, which is the typical Bloom-Davis, economic uncertainty, just taking into account news, looking at negative words associated with the economy, and geopolitical uncertainty is taking into account some keywords, news-based, geopolitical, sensitive to geopolitics. And as you can see here, one way to read this is if it's a positive number, it means the financial market uncertainty dominates general uncertainty. If it's a negative number, it means that general uncertainty dominates financial market uncertainty. So for instance, in the current period, it's negative for equity minus general uncertainty. So one way to read this is that either the equity market uncertainty has decreased relative to the general uncertainty, or the general uncertainty has increased relative to the equity market uncertainty, more than equity market uncertainty. So there's a bit more complacency from the equity market side. So that's one possible takeaway. But from the bond market uncertainty and general uncertainty, it's a bit more balanced. And this is for the US. And the reason why I took the US as an example is the fact that the numbers run all the way back, multi-year, right? Goes all the way back to the 80s or so. And you can see over the years, it has moved around quite a bit. But there is quite a bit of dichotomy, at least, in the more recent period over here. And this, again, can be read as a positive or negative. But the fact that, the equity market relative to the general uncertainty is a bit more, a bit more, is less responsive to the general uncertainty, can be a positive, and you can leverage that going forward. And I think that, and this comes back to the fact that the prior two slides, which I said, there are two-sided risks, and to the partnership, and I do think that there are ways to leverage off the private sector involvement to the partnership to further enhance the partnership between ASEAN and Australia. But the key takeaway, at least on this page, is really that it's unclear at this juncture whether this uncertainty is going to be stubborn or transitory, right? I mean, some of this uncertainty obviously is related to the change in the Trump administration, and with the Trump administration, the U.S. side politics and what's happening dynamically. But I think that one other thing to add is the fact that we also the partnership can also be distracted by the uncertainty, and preoccupied with the uncertainty, and that can be a negative, at least. But we have to also keep in mind, right? The whole idea behind the relationship partnership of Australia and ASEAN is to really enhance the integration from the economic side and the financial side. And this can potentially be undermined with the I guess with the current weaponization of the capital and trade flows. So I think that this is when things come in and it gets a bit more complicated. And like I said, to me, I think this is a two-sided risk, depending on how things evolve. So with that, let me finish off, and then I'm sure that there will be questions related to these topics. And like I said, the idea is just to give you a flavor of certain things you can think about behind the this whole partnership. And the first bullet summarizes quite well. And this in quotation is from the 21st Australian Prime Minister Whitlam, who basically said that the partnership back in the 70s, when they started it, as a dialogue, partner, is unquestionably the most important, the most relevant, and the most natural. In fact, because we're in the region, and that's why I think the whole relationship expanded beyond the economics aspect. And one of the things to note, however, is the Australia Southeast Asia Economic Strategy, which goes out to 2040, prioritizes 10 key sectors. And these are the sectors: agriculture, creative industries, digital economy, and so on and so forth. There are some numbers behind some of these things. For instance, the Australia for ASEAN Futures Initiative, there's a multi-year committed Aussie dollar 204 million investments, the fourth bullet. Similarly, the Southeast Asia Investment Financing Facility, there is Aussie dollar about 2 billion in loans, guarantees, equity, insurance. I mean, there are a lot of other things, these are just two of them we just picked out. But I think broadly, I think the way to take away is that going forward, this is an enduring partnership. And there are many aspects to this partnership. It's just not from the economic side only. It can broaden further. There are bumps, like I said, there are hiccups, there are some hurdles here and there. But ultimately, I think, as the third bullet, shows, we showed earlier chart, the fact that I think, at least from the economic side, trend, right, international trade can potentially grow as much as 2.5 to 3 times the current level as you go out to 2040. And I think that with that in mind, I'd be happy to at least take some questions, and maybe we can get into any discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. That was very insightful. As you mentioned at the top, you can now send in your questions for our speaker using the Q&A button on your Zoom app. We actually have a question for you, Tom, from the audience.
Right.
This is, to what extent do currency fluctuations between the Australian dollar and ASEAN currencies impact equity market performance in the region? So in your opinion, how would that, surmise?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the FX, flows, the FX risk, obviously, both, like I said before, they are very export dependent. They are sensitive to the global aspect, global economy, global final demand. And I think that there are many ways to look at this. I mean, the first way is that, through the trade channel, how exchange rates can impact it to some extent. But the trade aspect, can also be a positive, because, a weaker currency, whether it's ASEAN or whether it's Australia, if it's managed to some extent, can benefit exports and offset any headwinds. But as far as how the FX side affects the equity market side, I mean, this is just capital flows. I mean, when it comes to capital flows, like I said, this is something that when there is stress at the global level, the correlation jumps. And the fact that I showed that the equity market, both Australia and ASEAN, very much sensitive to China, more sensitive to China than the US at least. But the Aussie side, although it has decreased, it's still pretty strong. So I don't think we can move away from that fact, right? The fact that there is third level correlation that comes back and affects the financial market aspects, whether is it from the equity side to the currency, or the currency side to the equity spillovers. So yeah.
Got it. And just a question from the team here. In terms of the sectors within the ASEAN that would have potentially benefited from this partnership, or that might have been impacted by, just macro developments in the region, as you covered correlations and you covered equity sensitivities, right? Are there any particular sectors that you believe would be more positively impacted?
Yeah, I mean, there is I mean, we're always, the growth sectors, like for instance, energy transition is one of them.
Okay.
Infrastructure is also one of them. I mean, it's well known that the ASEAN, they're trying to build infrastructure aspects, and they are trying to, expand that. So yeah, so I think that but again, there could be positive spillovers from the other sectors, right? I mean, from the education, skill base, all this would spill over positively as well. I mean, I think the bottom line in this environment is that we need to keep in mind that this is an enduring partnership, but there's going to be hiccups, there's going to be bumps, there's going to be hurdles.
Got it.
And I think we need to be nimble and flexible in dealing with the changing circumstances, right? And I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that circumstances are changing in this environment. So I think you need to take that into account when thinking about the relationship between Australia and ASEAN.
Got it. And if I want to understand, Tom, what potential investment implications could there be, given the equity sensitivities that you have highlighted and the correlations that you've highlighted? What potential investment implications could there be for the ASEAN region, in general here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think one way to think about this is the fact that the public-private partnership is one way to go about, pushing for this and further enhancing the partnership between the two countries. And I think that, and there are many ways to structure that, to further goose that partnership. And from that, and like I said, that as I highlighted in the final slide, there are financing initiatives that you can come in and hit many different areas, and that could really raise it to the next level, right? And I think that and that would probably happen over time, depending on the speed and depending on which sectors come in first. Because I think that the general idea here is that the government comes in, both sides, the ASEAN governments, the Australian government, kickstart things, and then from there, the private sector comes in and start to get the ball rolling. And that's how, things can further expand, at least from that perspective. But like I said, I think that the whole idea behind this partnership is not really about, just one area or two areas, and not look at some of these aspects in isolation, because from one sector, it can potentially spill over to the next sector. And I don't think that, we should just look at one sector and say that there's only one or two sectors or several sectors that can potentially be positive, because I think there are spillovers, potentially.
So that's an interesting point, actually, Tom, which leads me to my next question, where we have seen that now ASEAN is sort of integrated into global value chains across time as well. We have more activity in sort of newer economy sectors like EVs and, potentially in the semis industry. Do you think that could have an impact, in the economic dependency that these regions have with each other? And could it affect the partnership?
Yeah, I mean, this is not an easy, area, because everyone has a different goal in mind in terms of how to push the green or climate finance or sustainability. I mean, Australia, for instance, I mean, they talked about being looking at green hydrogen, for instance, right? I mean, the ASEAN, different countries, they have different strengths and weaknesses, so they want to leverage on that. But I would bring in one point. I mean, the fact that I mentioned earlier, the trade side of things, right? There is a deficit between ASEAN and China, and I think that increasingly that deficit it comes from the fact that from China's industrial overcapacity, right? And some of these industrial overcapacity is really in the energy transition sectors like battery, EVs, like you mentioned, solar, and it's beginning to impact the ASEAN side negatively, for that matter, right? Because of the deficit, and of course the price aspects and so on, because of the overcapacity and so on and so forth. So I think that this partnership between Australia and ASEAN can potentially, you can say, mitigate, not fully offset, but mitigate some of the overcapacity from the Chinese, angle. on these green green sectors. So that's one way to think about it. So I think this makes sense as far as doing the partnership to try to like I said, mitigate some of these effects.
Got it. Got it. I think that is it from our end as well, Tom. If you have any other questions for Tom, you can drop them down on the Insight on Smartkarma, and we can address them right away then. So that's it for today. Thank you for your time today, Tom, and thank you all for attending. If you wish to keep track of Thomas's work, we recommend following his profile on Smartkarma so you don't miss out on any of his insights. Please also note that he is available for bespoke research requests or premium services. So if you wish to engage him for that, you can contact your Smartkarma account manager. Lastly, if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to email us at research@smartkarma.com. With that, I would like to wrap up today's webinar. Thank you and have a great week ahead. Thank you, Tom.
All right. Thank you, Mia.
Thank you, everyone.